¿Cómo están? A nombre de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara, me da muchísimo gusto darles la bienvenida al coloquio internacional de Muro a Muro. De Muro a Muro, bueno, pues lleva ya 5 años, este es nuestro quinto año en FIL-Guadalajara, como un coloquio dedicado a explorar nuevos paradigmas. Hay muchas transformaciones en el mundo. Bueno, yo diría que, digamos, y siempre es la premisa de Muro a Muro, entre la caída del muro de Berlín y la amenaza hoy afortunadamente, bueno, cuando menos pospuesta de terminar de construir el muro de la frontera que divide México de Estados Unidos, el muro de Trump, digamos, pues ha habido una gran efervescencia social, política, económica, cultural, en donde muchas cosas se están moviendo y en donde cada vez nos resulta más difícil entender la sociedad en la que vivimos. Por tanto, cada año de Muro a Muro busca tratar de explorar, tratar de entender estos nuevos paradigmas que estamos viviendo en las sociedades contemporáneas. Para esta edición de Muro a Muro nos pareció que un debate sobre la libertad era más que importante. En estos momentos, pues estamos viviendo tensiones importantes con respecto a la libertad. Quizás una de las imágenes más fuertes del año pasado fue la toma del Capitolio, el asalto al Capitolio por parte de hordas de defensores de la presidencia de Donald Trump, por hordas de defensores de un modelo que se antojaba claramente populista en el momento en el que Trump gobernaba los Estados Unidos y que nos llevaron a hacernos grandes cuestionamientos, nos llevaron a preguntarnos si era aceptable que en aras de su libertad de conciencia, de su libertad de pensamiento, de su libertad de asociación, de su libertad de acción, las personas que tomaron el Capitolio, bueno, pues atentaran contra instituciones garantes de la libertad en Estados Unidos. Eso llevó a una discusión sobre lo que sucede en el entorno digital, un entorno que prometía liberarnos, que prometía democratizar también la discusión, pero en donde la libertad es frecuentemente abusada y en donde, bueno, pues hay muchos problemas con respecto a la noción de si se debe regular el espacio digital y quién debería o podría regular el espacio digital. Otro de los grandes temas de este último año fue la identidad, lo que en inglés se llama identity politics, es decir, qué tan libres somos de ser. Esto pasa por la reivindicación de derechos minoritarios, de minorías étnicas, raciales, sexuales, ideológicas, religiosas, hacer lo que son y hacerlo como son, pero también con el derecho a disentir y a disentir incluso de esas minorías y a lo que se ha denominado la cultura de la cancelación o el cancel culture. Y otra libertad de la que se ha hablado mucho en este año es la libertad de movimiento. Ha habido muchos movimientos migratorios por razones políticas, económicas, sociales en distintas partes del mundo. Y las reacciones de los gobiernos pues han sido severamente cuestionadas en México, en muchos otros países, a la luz de, pues digamos, la limitación de esa libertad de movimiento por razones que presuntamente buscan garantizar la estabilidad de un Estado y el bienestar de sus habitantes, de sus ciudadanos. Entonces, bueno, hablar de libertad hoy nos lleva a hablar de ciudadanía, nos lleva a hablar de migración, nos lleva a hablar de modelos políticos, nos lleva a hablar de identidad, nos lleva a hablar de libertad de expresión, de libertad de asociación y creímos este año en FIL-Guadalajara, en De Muro a Muro, que era un gran momento para plantearnos qué debe ser la libertad de expresión en la libertad de asociación, la libertad de tránsito, la libertad para vivir la propia identidad en sociedades contemporáneas. Tendremos 4 sesiones, como cada año en FIL-Guadalajara, sobre estos temas. Habrá una que se llamará Libres de Ser, habrá una que se llamará Libres en la Red, habrá una que se llamará Libres de Movernos, Pero esta primera lo que busca es ser una sesión más generalista, una sesión que analice la noción de libertad en términos abstractos, en términos generales y en términos de los modelos políticos que puedan garantizarla. Para eso tenemos hoy un elenco extraordinario. Nos acompaña una historiadora política holandesa que es Annelien de Dien. Annelien de Dien es autora de un libro muy reciente que se llama Freedom, que es una historia de la libertad y que evidencia las tensiones contemporáneas entre la noción de libertad y la noción de democracia. Nos acompaña también Chandran Kukatas. Chandran Kukatas es un filósofo migrante él mismo, de origen malayo, creció en Australia, vive hoy en Singapur, tiene dos libros seminales sobre el tema de la libertad. Uno se llama The Liberal Archipiélago, el archipiélago liberal, una teoría de la diversidad y de la libertad. Y tiene otro libro, un libro más reciente que se llama Migración y Libertad, Immigration and Freedom, en donde se ocupa específicamente de este asunto y en donde busca definir, digamos, los mínimos que deberían de vivirse y deberían de construirse desde el Estado en una sociedad de libertades. Y nos acompaña también y nos da mucho gusto Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz es una figura extraordinariamente polémica en el mundo contemporáneo, en Estados Unidos, para ser exactos. Él es un abogado de un perfil muy alto, un abogado que ha defendido a personajes que van de O.J. Simpson a Donald Trump, a pesar de ser un detractor importante de las políticas y las nociones trumpianas y de haber sido muy verbal en su disenso de Trump a la hora de enfrentar el presidente Trump un impeachment. Él, por creer más en los principios del liberalismo que en las ideas políticas, fue parte de su equipo de abogados defensores. Alan Dershowitz tiene dos libros recientes que tocan los problemas de los que hablamos. Cancel Culture, un libro sobre la cultura de la cancelación como un ataque a la libertad de expresión y al debido proceso, y The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, la defensa del liberalismo en una era de extremismo, que busca hacer, pues digamos, una definición de los principios liberales, pero también una reivindicación de los principios liberales en tiempos en que los ve amenazados y con ellos una idea de libertad. Nos da mucho gusto tenerlos a los tres. Hablaremos en inglés, tendremos esta sesión en inglés y voy a pasar. I'm going to switch to English as of now in order to have this conversation with our highly estimable panelists. Having such a diverse set of panelists coming from many countries, coming from many areas of work, and coming from many conceptions of freedom, I believe the best would be to start with a highly general question, which is, what should freedom look like and what can freedom look like in the 21st century? To be as fair as possible, I'll start alphabetically with Annelien.
Yes, thank you so much, Nicholas. So I'm a political historian, which means that when I think about freedom, I tend to think of the question, what is freedom in a political sense? So what does it mean to be free in a society or as a society? And I think when you ask most people that question nowadays, they tend to equate freedom with an absence of rules. So they tend to equate freedom with small government, right? The smaller your government, the freer you are, because the more you're able to do whatever you as an individual want to do. But I think that is a pretty sort of narrow understanding of freedom. And I think it might be time to recover an older conception of freedom, which I call the democratic conception of freedom. And under that notion of freedom, being free entails living under rules, not living under as few rules as possible, but living under rules that you yourself have co-created. So that means that in order to be free, what you need is a democratic society. What you need is to be able to exercise control over the way in which you are governed.
We're now getting to the problem of definitions. What is a democratic society?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. You know, on the most high level answer to that question is that we live in a democratic society as long as you have you know, certain procedures in place that allow individuals to exercise control over the way in which they are governed. And then the debate becomes really interesting when you start asking yourself, well, what does that mean? For instance, is a representative government, is that truly democratic, right? And there's sort of, you know, there's various opinions when it comes to that particular question. But, you know, I think there are good reasons to think that, you know, if certain conditions are in place, representative government will allow us to live, you know, in freedom. But in addition to that, I think we also need to ask ourselves what sort of further conditions do we want to implement in order to be able to live in a truly democratic society. I think when we start addressing that particular question, what we need to keep in mind is that in addition to these democratic procedures, you also need a particular kind of society. So one of the sort of traditions that I have examined in my book on the concept of freedom argued that if you want to have a truly democratic society, you need to have a system in place that prevents excessive economic inequality. That is an idea that was, for instance, first suggested by a 17th century British thinker named James Harrington. So his view was that if you have excessive economic inequality, you can never have a truly democratic society because the economic power of the elite will give it, you know, as much leeway over the political system that it will be able to, you know, sort of manipulate the political system to work in its own interest and hence to make the rest of the population unfree. So to summarize what I just said, if we want to establish a truly democratic society, obviously we need to think of, you know, proper democratic procedures. But in addition to that, I would argue that there's also good reasons to think of sort of preconditions, economic and social, that will allow us to establish such a democratic society.
Would the answer for that, in your view, would be a more centralized form of government?
Well, it depends. You know, the answer to that question depends. You know, more centralized than what?
The idea of the division of powers and checks and balances?
Well, that is a really interesting question. So there is another really powerful tradition. You know, when you're talking about freedom, that argues that, you know, true freedom depends on the establishment of proper checks and balances. But again, you know, that is not the only way of thinking of what it means to be free. This other tradition that I examine in my book sort of prioritizes the establishment of democratic control.
I believe the gentlemen will have many things to say on the subject because they've both written about, they both espouse liberal views, which are quite far from Anneline's views, and or what we call liberal views, because I imagine that if I ask Anneline if she's a liberal, she will probably say yes, but her definition of being a liberal would be very different from the one from Alan and the one from Chandran. And both of you have developed very complex and very rich definitions of what a liberal society is, what a free society is. So would you like to go first, Chandran?
Yes, I have a slightly different view to Anneline. I think largely because I'm less sympathetic to the idea of trying to recover the older tradition that she's written so eloquently about in her book. And I think mainly because I think what's really characteristic of the 21st century, and to some extent the 20th already saw this beginning, is the emphasis on equality, which we just don't find, I think, in the ancient world. In ancient Greece, for example, or Rome, we're really talking about, to the extent that there were even then democratic traditions of severe inequality. Only a very small proportion of the population had any kinds of political rights. And this is the context in which the idea of freedom, I think, as she's describing it, really emerged. Now, I completely understand that in later times, in the centuries she's referred to in the 17th, there are changes that emerge, but equality hasn't really become something as fundamental as it is now. And the reason that makes a difference is that our understanding of freedom now means equal freedom, that everybody has a claim to freedom. So I think this is the thing that's really most critical. And this is what gives us, firstly, modern conceptions of democracy as the foundation for legitimate rule. It gives us the modern kind of acceptance of forms of diversity that's so important, because we recognize to varying extents the significance of the claims of all kinds of people to be regarded as capable of enjoying freedom. So the threats to freedom, I don't want to say just come from governments. I think there's something to what Annelies is saying, to the extent that she's concerned about people simply thinking that we have more freedom if we have less government. But I think the liberal tradition that you've alluded to, that I see as something that we both have, a certain kind of commitment to, has at its core a worry about about power. They worry about political power. They worried about, in the past, the power of the clergy. They worried about the power of the aristocracy. And then more recently, liberals have become worried about the power of corporations, of major economic interests. And so to the extent that we're talking about liberal ideas, we're thinking about how do we contain these sorts of sources of power, which in different ways are a kind of threat to individual liberty. So in answer to your question about centralization, I think there are two respects in which one might be worried about centralization. One is the concentration of political power in a structure that fails to disperse it across different institutions. But the other worry is that that power fails to be dispersed across society, so that there isn't only an absence of internal institutional checks on authority, but there's also an absence of external sources of power. So that's how I think about freedom. We can still, of course, debate about how you would define freedom itself, and that's another, I think, aspect that's worth exploring further. And here in particular, I think the ancient traditions emphasize freedom as a kind of status one has, whereas now one thinks about freedom much more in terms of the range of options we have and the value of the options we have. But rather than go into a whole explication of this right now, maybe I'll stop and get back into it during the conversation.
No, but I believe you failed to give an idea that you have explored very richly, which is the idea of freedom as something that is all that you said, but also a perception of something one enjoys. What you have brilliantly written is that there is no freedom as long as one feels free. Could you expand on that a bit, please?
So here, I think what I want to emphasize, not to the exclusion of everything else, but the importance of the subjective nature of our conceptions of freedom. One can be, of course, misled about one's freedom, either in thinking that one's free when one is not, or in not fully appreciating how much freedom one has. But if someone really doesn't feel free, if they feel anxious, if they feel worried that their freedom might be lost, or they feel that they've got a range of options, none of which are really valuable to them, even though they're told that these are freedoms that they've got, then I would say that this is someone who's not really free, because such person doesn't actually feel free. As I said, it's not sufficient to feel free to be free, but it's got to be an important part of it. I don't think you can make someone free if that person just doesn't recognize this.
I also believe I failed to ask Annelien a pertinent question. My question on what constitutes democracy was a good one, if I may say so. But I did not ask what constitutes equality. And that's also a subject that you, Chandran, have explored. And the idea is equality of what and equality among whom. That's another subject that maybe we should expound on in a later part of the session. But I want now to give the floor to Alan, who has just written a very moving book, which is The Case for Liberalism in an Age of Extremism, in which is mostly his kind of autobiography as a liberal, a kind of statement of mission as a liberal, and a book that also sees very many threats towards liberal thinking. And I believe that implicitly there are many threats against the notion of freedom. So we have this vision of Annalene, who says that we maybe overvalue the idea of freedom nowadays, and maybe that we should qualify this freedom as a democratic freedom in which people had agency, and this agency would have to be derived from equality. And then we have this idea of Chandran, which is not quite the traditional idea of liberal thinking, but one that values freedom as something that is highly important in terms of freedom of conscience and freedom of association, which to his view are the two basic freedoms. And he also has written recently on freedom of movement, and not only because of a human rights vision, but also because of the idea that open societies that afford people to move in and out of them, are also freer for people who were born in them. And now you have this crisis, this view, Alan, of a crisis of liberal thinking, and maybe of the very idea of freedom. So in what ways do you think we could reconceive the idea of freedom and the values of freedom for the 21st century?
By asking a very different question. I agree with you that it's a good question. What is a democracy? What is equality? And what is freedom, or what is liberalism? We will never answer those questions. Everybody disagrees about what constitutes equality, what constitutes democracy, what constitutes liberty, what constitutes freedom. Everybody disagrees. We will never, ever come to a consensus about utopia. I think it's far better to come to a consensus about dystopia, and that is to come to an agreement about what is undemocracy, what is inequality, what is lack of freedom. There, I think we can agree. I wrote a book about that. It's called Rights from Wrongs, in which I set out a theory of how rights derive from a recognition of wrongs. And the thesis of the book is that we do recognize wrongs. We all agree that the opposite of freedom is slavery. We all agree that the opposite of democracy is tyranny. We all agree that we would never want to see a recurrence of slavery, the Holocaust, discrimination against gays, discrimination against women, etc. So it's much easier, and I think much more useful, to come to agreement about the dystopic rather than the utopic aspects of our debate today on democracy. There's just no way, even between the United States and Great Britain or Mexico, we have no agreement. Parliamentary democracy versus presidential democracy, impeachment, which is the mechanism by which we get rid of presidents, versus a vote of no confidence. The answer is it's all democratic. It's all democratic. But we understand that what's going on in Belarus is the opposite of democracy. We understand that what's going on in many other parts of the world is the dystopic view of democracy. The same thing with equality. I wrote a new book now called The Case for Colorblind Equality in the Age of Identity Politics. And in that book, I start with Martin Luther King. I have a dream. My dream is that someday my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character. Martin Luther King couldn't make a statement like that on American college campuses today. He'd be called a racist, he'd be canceled, he'd be protested, and indeed he'd be banned. He wouldn't be allowed to speak. At the University of California today, it is a microaggression to say that the most qualified person should get the job. What could be a greater conflict about the definition of equality than whether equality should be based on merit or whether it should be based on identity? We all know what inequality is, but we'll never agree about what equality is. We've had debates between John Rawls, between Robert Nozick, between John Stuart Mill over the years as to what constitutes liberty. Rawls came up with a brilliant conception of democracy, a veil of ignorance where you don't know whether you're going to be rich, poor, black, white, male, female, ugly, handsome, healthy, unhealthy, and you have to come up with a set of rules that would be self-satisfying without the knowledge of where you fit in the scale of things. It's brilliant, but it's incomplete. Mill came up with a wonderful notion of liberty. The government has the power only to stop you from doing things that hurt other people, but not things that hurt yourself only. But when we test that against vaccine mandates, when we test that against other intrusions by government, we find that Mill doesn't provide the micro answers. He only gives us a macro way of looking at things. So my suggestion in my few-minute opening is that we do not ask the question, what is a democracy? We do not ask the question of what is liberty, what is equality, what is freedom. We focus on the opposite, and we move from there toward a structure of rights that allows us to continue to disagree about what is equality, what is democracy. We can continue to do that, and we'll never resolve it. Even on this panel, where we all call ourselves classic liberals, we will simply not agree. Another example, in an effort to create economic equality, every society in history has had to compromise liberty. So there are conflicts, and we have to resolve the conflicts, and you resolve them through democracy. You cannot achieve equality without curtailing liberty. If liberty includes the liberty to earn money, the liberty to give money to one's children, those are inherently mechanisms for inequality. And if those mechanisms for equality are denied, then some liberty is denied. So if anybody expects in the hour that we have devoted to this to solve the problem of what is democracy, what is equality, what is liberty, what is freedom, it's a futile effort. If we can come to some agreement as to the dystopic aspects of this, I think we will have made tremendous progress.
You think we can come to some agreement, at least in this panel?
I think we can. I think we can begin. We can begin by the worst first. What are the worst inequalities? What are the worst lacks of democracies? And the further we go up the scale, the more we will disagree. And closer we come to the worst, we will agree. Everybody will agree about slavery. Everybody, I think, on this panel will agree that treating people differently, let me put it this way, because maybe it isn't right. Maybe we won't agree that treating people differently on the basis of race or gender is wrong. Treating people worse because they are a woman, because they are gay, because they are Black, I think we will all agree is wrong, is dystopic. Then we get to the next level. But should people be treated better because of their identity politics in order to make up for historic discrimination? There we would begin to argue, and reasonable people could argue about race-based affirmative action or identity politics. So the less ambitious we are, the more we'll agree. And the more ambitious we are, the less we will agree.
What about you, Annalene? Do you think you could agree to these terms that Alan is now putting on the table, the terms that we should agree on what we do not want? Is it possible to agree as a democratic society which values freedom to agree on what we do not want?
I think this is an interesting suggestion. It reminds me of something that Judith Shklar has termed liberalism of fear. So the kind of liberalism that focuses indeed on what we should fear the most. But I do have a worry about that strategy. And the worry is that perhaps we'll end up agreeing about some very basic things. But I do wonder that, or I do fear that by focusing on dystopia and leaving, the formulation of more utopian visions for other people, I do worry that we'll end up leaving something really important on the table. So, for instance, if we look at the situation in the United States, perhaps it's too strong to term it dystopic, but I do think there are real reasons to be extremely concerned about the future of freedom in the United States, for reasons that are, in my view at least, very different from the reasons that Alan just mentioned. I think the real problem of the United States political system is that it has so many built-in systems or built-in elements that prevent people from having actual say over their government. So that's what I would identify as the most pressing problem. And I fear that by just focusing on a common view of dystopia, what we'll avoid doing is formulating a more positive vision in terms of freedom utopian society.
I don't disagree with that, but I also don't want to let you assume that even the dystopic is simple. Take, for example, I think we would all have agreed 10 years ago that one of the elements of dystopia is suppression of speech, is censorship, and is denial of due process. 10 years ago, we could agree with that. Today, people on the hard left, people in the so-called woke culture, want to abolish freedom of speech for those they disagree with. That's been long in doing, from Plato to many others, and due process. The Me Too movement wants to do away with due process. If a woman accuses a man, that's the end of the inquiry. You don't need a trial. You don't need due process. We know that women tell the truth. We know that men lie. That's the end of the inquiry. Why do we have freedom of speech? Freedom of speech is patriarchal. It's imperialistic. It gives advantages to the wealthy and to the intelligent and to the born privileged. So today, even the most fundamental aspects of liberty, democracy are being challenged by the hard left. So we'll have a hard time even coming to agreements about the dystopia. I will not be able to agree with the hard left on dystopia. There are those in the hard left who would go even further and permit violent assassinations, people who make it more difficult to achieve the perfect egalitarian society. So the issue of means and ends, we always mostly agree on ends. The issue of means and ends is one that will make it even very difficult to come to agreements about what is undemocratic, what is illiberal, what is unequal.
As a reader of Chandran's work, I believe he may have many things to say about that, because this debate is an example of what you have described as a feature of contemporary societies in which we agree on very little. As we have seen, we don't even agree on what we do not agree on. So, and you have devised an idea in which, in order to have political coexistence, we should agree on very little, but the state should be a guarantee of the defense of that very little on we agree. What is your vision from that perspective on the necessary social consensus to be constructed in order to further both democracy and liberty?
Well, I think where I agree with Alan is it is very difficult to construct that consensus, as he's, I think, rightly noted out, even when it comes to agreeing on what is dystopic, it's really very difficult. But nonetheless, I think there is an important insight in what he's saying, which I would like to draw out a little bit, if I may. And that is, I think, what's really significant is the extent to which we disagree about things, because however much we might recognize different sorts of values, what we also are faced with inevitably is the need to make trade-offs, both between different values and also within different values. So let's say you valued free speech, but the question is, how much do you value it? I think it's very hard to find someone who gives no weight to it at all. But I think Alan is quite right in some of his observations, certainly about the extent to which it's been disvalued to some extent, even by people who we thought 10 years ago would be speaking up very strongly for it. So I think the challenge, therefore, is something that has to be enjoined not by trying to settle certain questions, even I think, and this is where I would disagree with Alan, to try to settle the question of what is the minimum, for example, because even there, I think we'll get a lot of disagreement about what is better and what is worse than worse, if you see what I mean. So I think once we recognize the inevitability of our disagreements about the ways in which trade-offs are going to be always made differently by different people, then what we need to, I think, push for is what I would call, the liberal values of toleration, of the speech rights that must go with this, the importance of engagement, the importance of recognizing that we have differences and so on, which in itself is not going to be particularly easy, especially if you've got a group that's saying, no, we've got to silence that because some things are beyond the conversation. So to that extent, I think really all we can do is just, to the extent that we are committed to liberal values, keep pushing the idea that these things have got to be brought back into the conversation. They can't be excluded. We can't push people or ideas aside, no matter how uncomfortable we may find them. So just to go back to the earlier part of your question to Nicholas, you suggested that what I was going to argue for is a certain number of guarantees that, say, a government or a state might try to offer to ensure that there are certain minimal conditions that are met, or indeed that we try to just agree on a few things rather than agree on everything. I don't think governments can supply these guarantees, but I think it is something that we need to think about, to what extent we're trying to really get deep agreement, and to what extent what we are looking for is to find agreement on getting along, keeping the conversation going, keeping an open mind to others, reflections and commitments and the ways in which they want to trade off different values.
Well, I do share the worries about free speech that have just been expressed, and I think it is really important that we try to keep as many voices and ideas in the conversation as possible. But I think there's another sort of aspect to how do we establish free speech, which hasn't been mentioned yet, and which I think is equally, if not more important. In order to have true free speech, you need to give as much as this is possible, everybody the same sort of footing. And I think in this regard, again, the question of economic equality arises. Because if you have a society with extreme economic equality, then the sort of the danger arises that some people will will simply have more means to express their ideas and views and persuade other people of their ideas and views. We could think of Brexit as one example. You might argue also sort of undermines the equal footing of all people in the marketplace of ideas. And I think that's another worry we should have about free speech that I don't really hear mentioned all that often, because the debate, in my view, focuses really too much on the so-called cancel culture and the problem of, or the assumption that some people who are then described as woke try to exclude others from participating in the conversation.
Well, you disagree with that approach. What you're saying, some people have too much free speech because others don't have enough. For me, the answer is always to give the people who are excluded more free speech, but never to take away from those. I'd make an analogy to healthcare. One of the greatest inequalities we have in the world today is healthcare. But I wouldn't take excellent healthcare away from anybody. I would try to give good healthcare to many people, or the right to counsel. People complain all the time that only the rich get lawyers like me, who have a very good record of getting people acquitted. The answer to that is not to deny rich people the right to have me, but to require me, for example, to do half my work pro bono, which I do. So the answer in the free speech context should never be diminishing free speech, denying free speech to some who we think have too much free speech. It's true in some respects that free speech is a zero-sum game. The more I have, the less you have. But it's extremely dangerous to try to take it away from some in an effort to create equality. We've all talked about the right to disagree. I have to tell you, this very conversation could not occur on many American campuses today. We do not have a right to disagree. When I defended President Trump, even though I voted against him and didn't like his administration and hope he doesn't run again, I lost my friendships with people. People wouldn't talk to me about it. They just said, you are canceled. Yes, cancel culture really exists. You are canceled. You can't speak to our groups. You can't write in our newspapers. You can't appear in our television stations. You can't come to our dinner parties. And today on the hard left, we do live in an atmosphere of complete cancel culture and denial of the right to disagree and the right of toleration. I think we've lost the basic fundamental right we've lost over the last 10 years, and Donald Trump was part of it. Part of the reason for it, he provoked it, is toleration. We do not any longer tolerate other people's ideas, and I think that's part of the dystopia that I would hope we would agree to, and that is we must always tolerate other ideas. We must always give everyone, sure, try to create as much equality as possible, but give everyone the right to express their views and not deny anybody the right to free speech in the name of equality.
My last question is, if we should promote a piece of legislation or a public policy in order to further democracy and freedom, what would you promote?
Well, that's an easy one. I would say that what we need are laws that make it harder to amass wealth, both by private individuals, by families, and by corporations.
And you believe that this curtailing of economic inequality or of extreme economic inequality would have what benefits?
Say a sufficient precondition to establish a well-functioning democracy, but I do think it's a necessary condition. And I think that developments in all over the world have sufficient of the past, let's say 30 years, have sufficiently shown that in the face of extreme economic inequality, maintaining a well-functioning democracy is nearly impossible.
Thank you, Annalene. Alan.
It's very hard. I don't think there's one single bit of legislation that could do it, but I would like to think of legislation that would promote dialogue, promote diversity of views, promote the right to disagree. Maybe it would be a requirement that all media that has governmental involvement make available speech to as many as possible. Now, all speech is not equal. There's better speech than worse speech. We've just had a very thoroughly intellectual discussion. It wouldn't have been as intellectual if we had people screaming from the outside and trying to shut us all down. We have to understand that the right of free speech means the right to heckle, the right to boo, the right to protest. So my answer to Citizens United or rules that encourage wealthy and corporate interests to speak is to make it easier for others to get a voice. A little of that has been accomplished through the internet, through Twitter, through YouTube, but that has created its own problem. I can't find a single piece of legislation, but my thrust would be to increase tolerance, diversity of views, the right to disagree, and get more people involved rather than cut back on the people who are currently involved.
Chandran?
Yeah, I think like Alan, I'm not so optimistic about any one piece of legislation or even a plethora of legislative enactments. I think in part it's because the way I think about politics is that, firstly, it tends to be reactive, and the idea that somehow one could do things differently. Let's say that if one got a hold of the levers of power and was able to enact legislation, I think that's just a very unlikely account of the way in which politics operated. For example, if you wanted to try to minimize the capacity of people for wealth accumulation, it just runs against the historical record. There was a study recently of who were the richest Italian families in the 15th, 16th century. And if you trace them back, they're the same ones 500 years later. The governments have been trying to get a hold of that wealth for 500 years and they haven't been able to do it. I'm just not optimistic, even though I share with Annelies a really growing concern about inequality. But one thing that's also very evident is you compare countries across the world, the level of extractiveness of political elites varies quite a lot. I mean, they range from much, much lower in places like Switzerland to much, much higher in Belarus. That is to say, how much do the elites produce and how much do they just take for themselves? It's a huge difference. So I think one of the things we need to understand is what is it that makes the difference? Because it's not straightforwardly a matter of legislation. It's a matter of different kinds of regimes, and unsurprisingly, liberal regimes do better on this score. I think what we need to understand is why. And my guess is it's not the legislation that's making the difference. What's making the difference is the ethos of the population, what the population will expect from their governments, what they will tolerate. And I think, in this respect, to give a jersey to the old Marxist Gramsci, I think he was onto something when he says that, it's really what the people think. It's, his strategy, therefore, was to try to transform civil society into a way of thinking that was more critical of the liberal ideas he rejected. My strategy would be to take his strategy, but to different ends, to try to bring people to see certain things that I think they're not seeing. Unless you do that, all the legislation in the world won't help you.
I have one suggestion that I wonder if the three of us could agree to. Could we all agree that an enormous amount of progress would be made if we created a law that gave relatively equal medical care and early education to everybody? That is, everybody under the age of 18 would have access to excellent medical care and excellent educational opportunities without taking it away from other people who might be able to afford more. Wouldn't that help create on the equality thing down the line? Wouldn't it help to even the playing field for those who were born wealthy? Can we agree that we don't do enough to make equal medical care and educational opportunities available to everybody?
I'd agree with that. I think where people tend to differ, though, is on what they think will achieve it. I think that's the tricky part, and I don't know how to do that, but I don't disagree with you on that.
Annelien?
Yes, I mean, obviously, this is of key importance. But I agree with Chandran that the real question is how do you go implementing that? Because it might be hard to do that without taking something away from other people.
Right.
Let me say a word that might offer an answer. Social democracy. Would that be an avenue that you would possibly agree on, coming from very different ideological frameworks, all the three of you?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I was introduced earlier as a liberal and I wouldn't self-identify as such, also because where I come from, so Europe, the term liberal actually means something very different from what it does in the US. I imagine the Americans, and more broadly speaking. So in my country, a liberal is something very similar to what in the US is often described as a conservative. So it means that you're on the hard right and you're in favor of as much economic freedom as possible. So that's why I don't self-describe as a liberal. I self-describe as a social democrat.
Would you agree on social democracy as a possible way, Alan?
Well, everything depends on definition. As long as a certain amount of freedom is permitted, I subscribe to the American term liberal, but I also admire the people of Europe because the term liberal, although it led to economic conservatism, the liberals in Europe, which are the Conservative Party in England, favor a woman's right to choose, favor gay marriage, oppose the death penalty, favor restrictions on guns, adopt most of what we call the liberal agenda in the United States. So I will insist on being called a liberal, social democrat. You know, it reminds me of what my friend Bob Nozick, who was a dear friend of mine, once said. He was a libertarian. And he wrote the book on libertarianism, State, Anarchy, and Utopia. He said, through the end of his life, he continued to be a libertarian. He just didn't like libertarians. He didn't like the people who called themselves libertarians, so he wasn't part of the movement. I have some of the same concerns about social democrat. I like the concept of social democracy. I just don't like some of the people who call themselves social democrats because they're more social than they are democratic. They are more communitarian than they are libertarian. So we have to be careful about terms and what exactly we mean by them. So I think I'm going to stick to liberal.
Chandran?
Well, with all these things, it does very much depend on the question, as compared to what. And of course, there are varieties of social democracy. I still think of myself essentially as a liberal. Those are the commitments I have. They're not entirely incompatible with many things that social democrats are likely to hold to be important. But I think for me, the core commitments I would still think of best described as liberal. I think about the origins of the term as a political term in the emergence of the Spanish liberales in the early 19th century, and I think what they were essentially concerned about was combating privilege. And that's how I think of liberalism. They're concerned about the rise of power and those who secure it by gaining privileges for themselves. The church, the aristocracy in those days, but now in the modern world, I think there are other sorts of sources of attempts to preserve privilege for particular parts of society. So I see the liberal tradition as essentially concerned about how you address that problem. To some extent, democratization is a solution to a part of this problem, but it also comes with difficulties of its own. So I don't want to throw democracy out, but I think it's also something that needs to be tempered, and I think it's best tempered with the form of liberalism.
I was not here looking for answers, but I was looking for questions, and I believe all three of you pervade me with excellent questions and pervade the audience with excellent questions today on topics that we should reflect upon, either from a liberal, a social democrat, a libertarian, a socialist, or just a citizenship perspective. Thank you ever so much to all three of you, Annelien Dedin, Alan Dershowitz, Chandran Kukatas. It's been a privilege having you as our keynote speakers, our inaugural panel on the From Wall to Wall colloquium. And I look forward to seeing you soon in Guadalajara when we have the freedom to travel, which we sadly do not have today because of an evil tyrant that is not human. So he's even more evil. Thank you ever so much. Y gracias a ustedes por habernos acompañado en la sesión inaugural del coloquio de Muro a Muro de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara. Nuestra segunda sesión es presencial y es en 1 hora. Nos vemos muy pronto en Expo Guadalajara. Gracias y buenas tardes.
Thank you.